democracy in Cuba.
That's right.
So,
in 1999, this first one in 1999. This one just came out a few months ago, 2013.
So the democracy in Cuba is of great interest.
Yeah, I would say this is my specialty, yes.
Absolutely. Okay, so without further ado.
What does democracy look like in the United States, Venezuela, and Cuba? I would like to start with the United States. Everything I'm going to say about the United States and what I've written, it's quite a radical position on democracy in the United States, but I want to let you know that it's based on investigation. And just so no one feels heard here, I don't want to ruffle anyone's feathers who are Americans regarding democracy in the United States, just to let you know that pardon? Well, we'll get to that. Just to let you know that I dedicate my book, in addition to the Cuban Five, I also dedicate my book to all the peoples of Cuba, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as the peoples of the United States, especially those academics and activists such as yourself who are fighting against the status quo. So while I have a very specific position on the United States, my feelings lie with the peoples of the United States. It's not quite the same. Now, you just mentioned, is there democracy in the United States? Well, when I wrote my book, I decided my chapter in the United States, chapter 2, should be called Democracy in the United States. Now, when I say that, some people say, well, come on, it's a bourgeois democracy. Well, I think it's important to examine how this democracy actually works. Because it's important, you know, either you have the official position, it's a great democracy. Not only that, it has to be exported all over the world, whether you like it or not. Or people say, well, it's a bourgeois democracy. And if people say, well, it's a bourgeois democracy, some of these people, I find, for example, would have illusions about Obama in 2008 and say, well, I'll vote for Obama, the lesser of two evils. Several people say that. Quite a few. It's quite rampant in 2008, less so in 2010. So my conclusion was it was important to look into how democracy actually operates in Cuba and not in the United States, and not actually get caught up in these stereotypes. It's a bourgeois democracy or it's a great democracy. So I just as an introduction to democracy in the United States, I investigated. I'm really very much interested in history, because history tells us how things operate now. Okay? And I looked into the very initial stages of the United States, the beginning of the 17th century, with the Puritans and others and their basic outlook was an evangelical outlook based on the Bible. And they literally said, we are the chosen people. We are sounds familiar because they say that now. Including Obama. You know, the United States should be a beacon for the world. And they developed this whole evangelical extreme outlook with regards to the United States. And I guess here people are familiar with this. Is basically has come down right to the current situation now. In fact, just to jump ahead, I examined all of Obama's writings, and he actually says the same thing, but the words are a bit more touched with the Ivy League, Harvard way of talking, but the essence is the same. The United States is the greatest nation of the world. We are the leaders of the free world. We have to civilize the world, etc. Now, the other important point I would like to make that has, regarding democracy in the United States, which has an important influence in understanding how democracy in the United States operates now, aside from this evangelical outlook based on the Bible, is that we know about the Declaration of Independence, the end of the 18th century, or some people would wrongly call the American Revolution. But I investigated clearly what was the Declaration of Independence, the so-called war, the American Revolution. And based not on my own feelings, but investigating what American colleagues, American historians have come up with lately in the last few years with regarding to that experience. And what it really was is the following. It's outlined in detail in my book, that the 13 colonies fought against Britain. They were against the Church of England. They fought against Britain. But who was their main ally? It was France against Britain. So to make a long story short, my investigation has shown, along with colleagues from the United States, that that war of independence was really a struggle between three powers: two old colonial powers, Britain and France, and one new power, new colonial power, the 13 colonies, that even before it became independent was already becoming an expansionist, racist, later colonialist, and later imperialist power, while still being a colony. And so, you know, some people say, do you believe in American exceptionalism? Well, you might find it strange for me to say, yeah, I believe in American exceptionalism, in a sense that it is an exception in the history of the world that you have a country coming out of colonialism, as it happened in the end of the 18th century, and as it was coming out of colonial domination, it was itself becoming a colonial power. And right from the beginning, that, you know, that colonial power in embryo, in coming into being, already was looking towards the south, not only towards Mexico and Texas, but also to Cuba and Puerto Rico and Latin America, and later on the whole world. That is American exceptionalism, in a sense that it was right. So these basic things have fascinated me, because the evangelical, you know, mission to civilize the world, the expansionism as an integral part of the democracy in the United States, it's important and has its basic foundations. For example, a lot of things are discussed in the United States regarding the budget and money and things like that, whether it's now or before. But one thing is never really discussed, it's hidden from the discussion, is the amount of money that goes into the war machine in the United States. A lot of colleagues such as Michael Parenti and others, they've documented, and Noam Chomsky, everything is discussed, but not that. You can't touch that. And that goes all the way back to the 18th century, the Puritans and their expansionism. It goes back to the 13 colonies, coming out of a competition with Britain and France to take, as it says in the actual Constitution of the United States, to take itself as itself among the powers of the world in the 18th century. Now, what I did, I always found, right from my early days studying the United States and democracy, that there are a lot of illusions about democracy in the United States. We know that. So I took, in order to deal with that, I took the most difficult challenge. That is Obama. Because Obama, whether one likes it or not, he was presented as the epitome of change, as sort of the best example that there's a difference between the Democrats and Republicans, that the United States is able to change things through elections. So this was a godsend for me. I was happy he was there, because that was the biggest challenge. So what I did, without any preconceived notions, I studied, and it's all documented in my book in detail, I studied everything that Obama has said and written, from his 2004 speech to the Senate, when he said, we are, and this is not African American United States, this is not a Latino United States, this is not a white United States, this is the United States of America. In other words, he was the person to usher in this so-called era, post-racial era. And I studied his book in 2004, his second book in 2006, in detail, very, very cautiously and all that. And all these quotations are there in my book, but I'd just like to give you the main conclusion is that at that time, when he was about to run for president, some of the main leaders at the time, Brzezinski and others who worked behind the scenes, said, United States in 2008, they said, we have a major credibility gap. We have a credibility gap in Latin America. He mentioned Venezuela, credibility gap in Egypt, other countries, in Europe, as well as within the United States, especially amongst the African American population, amongst the Latino population and other sections. So what we had to do, they say, is to find someone who could close that credibility gap. Now, in reading through everything that Obama said and written from 2004 till my book was published, in 2013. He had given, with appropriate buzzwords, you know how things operate in your country here, it's the same thing in Canada, through buzzwords. Buzzword means like a small clip, you know, a couple of key words. He gave the right buzzwords to the ruling oligarchy in the United States, that he was the best person to continue U.S. policies abroad and keep the lid on domestic uprising within the United States of America. We were talking about Vietnam, some people from my own generation who were involved in Vietnam. Like what he says about Vietnam was really interesting. He was supposed to be someone progressive, but what he wrote about Vietnam, he ridiculed all of us who were in the movement in the 1960s and 1970s against U.S. aggression in Vietnam. And there was a lot of these type of buzzwords. At the same time, he also gave the impression that he was, you know, symbolic of change, something new with regards to the Bush administration. So one of his quotes were that the war in Iraq was dumb. He wasn't against the war in Iraq as a basic principle. He said it was dumb. So what I wrote in my book, I asked, well, if it's a dumb war, what does a smart war mean? And now we know. The smart wars are these drones that are going all over the place and killing people in a much larger level than the Bush administration and others before took over. So this is how he wrote and talked from 2004 right till his second mandate. Buzzwords that he's okay with the status quo. In fact, he can carry out things much better than the Republicans, and he did. And at the same time, with regards to the domestic situation. So, regard with the domestic situation is really important. I also watch very carefully the Occupy movement here in New York, as well as elsewhere in the United States, and similar movements developed in Canada, in Spain, etc. Now, when Obama came to power in 2008, aside from his capacity to increase aggression against the peoples of the world, which he did, and we haven't seen the end of it yet because he has another couple of years to go in his mandate, is that he also put a lid on that section of the American society which is historically most revolutionary and progressive, and that is the African Americans. It's a fact of life, unfortunately, and I quote here in my book, not from myself as a Canadian or whatever, but from people such as the Black Agenda Report from California, for whom I have a lot of respect. And what they say is that one of the main features of the psychology amongst the African American movement is, since 2008 and even now, that we can't rock the boat. We have an African American in the White House, which is really, really dangerous. So you could have imagined if while the Wall Street movement was going on, which is mainly, non-Afro-American, middle class, whatever, but very sincere people fighting for the interests of all of them. If this was able to be joined by the African Americans, there would have been perhaps a major revolt in the United States, and that's one of the reasons that Obama was put into power by the ruling oligarchy. So just to give you some examples, I'd like to mention one other thing that is not really very well known, and I'd like to mention it because some people here are former political prisoners, and it's an important issue in the United States, democracy in the United States, and that is the question of the right to vote. In the United States of America, there are two types of, first of all, you have to be registered to vote, right? It's not automatic, such as in Cuba, which I will believe. You have to be registered to vote, which is a major struggle to get registered to vote. Now, in the United States of America, and this is based on my study of American colleagues who specialize in this field, there are two types of crimes. There are misdemeanors, relatively not crimes that are not that bad, from 0 to 1 year in prison. Then there are felonies, which is more than 1 year in prison. Okay, she's my coach. Okay, don't tell me the whole story first. So for felonies in the United States of America, okay, if you're a felon and you're in prison you don't have the right to vote. We could say, okay, that happens in a lot of countries. Your prisoners don't have the right to vote. So let's concede on that. But, however, United States of America is the only country in the world where in many states, felons, even after they get out of prison, have did their time, they haven't done anything wrong, they're working, whatever, they lose their right to vote for life.
That's right.
The right to vote for life. There's no other country in the world who does that, who has that. Okay? So that, what does this figure mean in terms of, you know, this great democracy where people are elected, you know, whatever, as president? In the United States of America, there's one American political scientist and expert on voting trends in the United States called Professor McDonald, which I quote abundantly in my book. He worked out this concept of voting age population. Not just if you have the right to vote because you managed to register, but you're 18 and over, and in theory have the right to vote in the United States. Voting age population. So that also includes felons who lost their right to vote. It includes many Latinos. By the way, Latinos, I also document that, have the right to work, right, to pay taxes, and not only to go into the army and fight and risk their life, they're actually recruited actively into the army, but they don't have the right to vote. So that's one of the main contradictions of democracy and the US. So in the 2008 elections, when elections took place, the voting age population turnout vote was 57%. You know, if you go back to 2008, there's this big worldwide thing. Obama got elected, the whole world is changing, the whole world was in love with Obama, he got the majority of votes, but only 57% of the voting age population voted in 2008. Now, as we know, in general, the vote is split between the Republicans and Democrats. So I'm not great at math, but a half of 57 is what is about 26, 27%. So someone gets elected on that basis, half of 57%. And in 2008, the voting age population went down from 57 to 54%. And half of that, of course, went to the Republicans, the other half to the Democrats. So that's one aspect I think to keep in mind when it comes to evaluating how democracy in the US operates. Now, as I was going through this examination of democracy in the US, I noticed in terms of the credibility gap, how Obama is able to carry out things domestically and internationally better than Bush or better than McCain or Romney after that. So I was coming to the conclusion, you know, this thing about the lesser of two evils, okay? We're continuously told this in the United States, and there's a spillover effect as well in Canada, because even Canada is supposedly an independent country. You know, we're dominated by CNN and the American news and all that. It's part of what I call in my book, the Americanization of the world, which of course I'm against, but it's still a problem. So we are told in the United States, and this is continuously, whether it's Fox News, CNN, New York Times, they say, well, there's the Democrats and Republicans, there's the left and the right, there's the liberals and conservatives. And then we're supposed to be happy with this choice between these two options, whatever they're called. So the people in the United States have been largely been fed the illusion that you have a choice between two. So I was coming to the conclusion, what is this choice between the two? And then I read this article in Black Agenda Report from California. And they wrote, and I agreed, they were sort of groping at what I was thinking, that Obama is not the lesser of the two evils. He is rather the most effective of the two evils in carrying out the policy of the US ruling circles. That's right, the most effective of the two evils, which is true. Like if it was Bush or Romney or Palin, yeah, doing these things about drones, the espionage activities, what happened in Libya, in Syria and all that, there were people in the streets demonstrating. but it's relatively quiet in the United States. So he is the most effective of the two evils in carrying out not only the same policies as Bush or others before that, but more aggressive than ever. Yep. And in fact, I have a very controversial conclusion towards the end of my chapter of democracy in the US in dealing with the lesser of two evils. I also raise the question, which is that is it possible? I raise the question of the politics of the two-party system and the possibility of fascism. That is, first of all, the red herring that you have the red herring about the right wing in the United States. But is it possible? I just raise the question. I don't accuse. I don't come down very strongly saying that this is the case. But I do say that when we look at fascism in 2013, we don't have to look at fascism as it was exercised by Hitler in the Second World War. A white guy with a mustache, Heil Hitler. Can fascism be, because one of the main features of fascism is controlling the population domestically and carrying out aggression internationally. They're doing it now. And the control, instead of concentration camps, it can be done otherwise by controlling the minds. Like Noam Chomsky said, manufacturing consent. This is what he is doing, manufacturing consent, despite all of the contradictions in the United States. Unfortunately, he is still doing it. So this is basically my view of the United States. It's not a rosy picture, but I think it's better to look at the facts. It's better to look at the facts. It's all based on facts. I didn't make anything up, and most of my sources come from American colleagues, because I'm not American, I'm a Canadian. I don't like to come across as a Canadian putting down United States or whatever. My sources are mainly American scholars. So in my chapter, you'll see that whole section regarding democracy in the United States, and unfortunately many things that I wrote, and just before the book came out the press in January 2013, I even spoke about Trayvon Martin. I spoke about the atrocities in Afghanistan, and with regards to the gun violence and all that. And I said this thing is bound to carry on. Unfortunately, I wish I was wrong, but I was right. And why? Like, they have a big thing about gun violence in the United States, okay? But the essence of the question is the following. Like, they say, how come we can't stop it, everyone, people like Anderson Cooper is also wants to, deal with it, or Pierce Morgan, or the liberals. They all basically skirt around the issue. But the issue of gun violence is that in the United States of America, there is a huge industry of individuals who produce weapons and make money out of it, millions of dollars out of it. And in this system, this capitalist system, the people who make money out of selling guns, they're on a pedestal. You can't touch them. So of course the bottom line is there's a problem with the system. So these are some of the things that I deal with in my chapter, Democracy in the United States. And I think one of the most important things to deal with is the so-called lesser of two evils. Because it's going to come again soon, once again, with Hillary Clinton, probably the Democrat. A woman better than a man, or whatever, lesser of two evils. So what I basically say, that the worst thing in the United States is for people to have illusions about the lesser of two evils, because it forever postpones the necessity to develop a movement against the two-party system. That's a really important point as far as I'm concerned. And this brings me to my second example, Venezuela. I don't know Venezuela as well as I do Cuba. I've spent many years in Cuba studying that country, and I've been to Venezuela a couple of times as well. But Venezuela is really an important example, because in Cuba, we know, we're talking together, the revolution there took place, an armed revolution in 1959. I'm not saying it's out of date, but it took place in 1959. Whereas in Venezuela, what was the genius of Hugo Chavez? He organized a revolutionary movement, in my view, a revolutionary movement against the two-party system that existed in Venezuela before 1998. 1998, people know the history, the Punto Fijo. It was a pact between organized by the Venezuelan oligarchy and, of course, the United States, that they would change one party for the other. When one party got discredited, okay, throw them out. We'll have another party into power. Just like the United States, just like in Canada. It happens all over the place. Now, his genius was to organize a revolutionary movement against the old party system, but using the political system in place, the elections, which is the only path open to him at that time. And he actually won the election. And when he won the elections, his main electoral promise, if you want to put it that way, was that what we need in Venezuela is a new constitution. Remember what I said about the old American Constitution? I didn't mention it, but it was based on exclusion, and people had no input in the American Constitution in the 18th century. So he said that what we need is a new constitution, but a constitution that is worked out by the people. Now, when he won the elections in 1998, and he was sworn in as president, you know what he said? They gave him the Constitution. He said, "I swear on this moribund Constitution," and he went on. So he's a person of principle. He swore on the moribund Constitution, but right after coming into power as president, he and his collaborators started to organize a constituent assembly. That is, in normal modern day terms, you have people voting for delegates to form a constituent assembly who are delegated to work out a draft. I repeat, a draft of a constitution, not a final constitution. And then once the draft of a constitution is worked out, it is presented to the people for their input. And that is what happened in Venezuela after 1998. They worked out a draft constitution and it was sent to the people for their input. And I interviewed people from Venezuela who were involved in that, and they literally had crates and crates of suggestions coming in from the people, what to do, what to change, what to keep, what to amend. And then it came back to the Constituent Assembly, and was finally adopted with all of this input from the people. And then once again, it was presented to the people in a vote, democratic vote, for or against this constitution. The vast majority of people actually participated in the vote and voted in favor of this new constitution. Now, one of the main features of the new constitution, and aside from the fact which I think is important, is that people actually participated in working out the constitution, contrary to the United States of America. And one of the main features was the ability that the constitution gave the new revolutionary leadership to start chipping away at the oligarchy in Venezuela, especially those who own the petroleum industry, the oil industry. Now, I'm not trying to create the illusion that they did away with capitalism and socialism came in, but they did definitely start chipping away at the control by the wealthy few over the petroleum and industry in order to use those funds for the first time in the history of Venezuela for the well-being of the people of Venezuela. Health, education, etc. Now, I'm not saying that it's perfect anymore, that it's perfect in Cuba, but this was the basic orientation that Hugo Chavez ushered in when he overthrew the old party system, the two-party system. And this, of course, has developing since that time. And people are familiar with the recent history of Venezuela. And he has been really an innovator. Chavez has been an innovator with regards to developing a political process that favors participatory democracy. People's councils at the local level. There's all different kinds of formats which I outline in detail in my book. And with this has favored the participation in a daily way of the Venezuelan people. Without, once again, saying, but I have to say that it's not perfect. There are drawbacks. He himself has said that many times, problem of bureaucracy. There are also problems that people who call themselves Chavistas, but they're only in it for their own personal well-being. Pardon?
You find that everywhere.
That's right. And, you know, Venezuela is no exception. But they actually developed this type of participatory democracy, which is something entirely new for Venezuela, and also I think it's a contribution to the world movement for people who are interested in participatory democracy. Now, of course, we have to go into most recent history when Chavez passed away. Now, when Chavez passed away, what was the role of the United States? They basically said it was Obama, you know, the supposedly lesser of two evils. You couldn't have had a more provocative statement coming from the leader of any country in the world. And he actually said, well, Chavez passed away. Now is a chance perhaps to turn over the pages and usher in some, you know, democracy in Venezuela. Very, very provocative. And even the government of Canada, Harper, a conservative government, said the same type of thing, but at least he hypocritically offered his condolences to the people of Venezuela, where Obama did not do that. He said this is a way, you know, a manner in which we could open up a new chapter. Now, with regards to democracy in Venezuela, participatory democracy in Venezuela, all the developments that are going on there, which is a relatively new compared to other countries such as Cuba, let us go back to the April 14th elections. These were the elections that took place April 14, 2013, the first elections after Hugo Chavez passed away the previous month. And it's quite recent, April 14, 2013. As many of you may know, the results were very close. Very, very close. Okay? But, you know, it's a complicated situation. But what was the role of the United States in this from there until now? Obama, as the leader of the, you know, the democratic world with the whole baggage of all the elections that took place in the, you know, United States since the beginning, said, well, on April 15, he said the elections are very close. We have to have an audit. We have to check the elections. And they quoted Capriles, the opposition leader, who said, well, we have to check the elections. There's something fishy and all that. On the same day that he said that, on April 15th, 2013, that's right, 2013, you had these provocative incidents taking place in Caracas and other parts of Venezuela, organized by Capriles, you know, in which they attacked the health centers, which were manned by Cuban doctors and health workers. When I was in Caracas in August 2013, I met these centers. I went to these centers and I met with the Cuban doctors and other people involved in these activities there. And it really is one of the most impressive experience that I ever had in my life. That in Venezuela you have these centers, you have everything for every aspect of health. You have people, specialists there, working with newly trained Venezuelan doctors. Now these people from Cuba were there. They were physically attacked by the Capriles pro-American forces on April 15, 2013. And I think there were 11 people assassinated by the Capriles forces. Why? Because they were there to protect with their own chests their Cuban comrades, and also that whole system that was put into place starting in 1998. And what was the goal? In my view, the goal of April 15, 2013 was very clear. It was to provoke an incident, or provoke incidents that would give the pretext for the United States to more openly intervene in Venezuela and overthrow the newly elected Maduro government. There's no doubt in my mind. And the reason there's no doubt in my mind, they haven't stopped doing that since April 15, 2013. For example, the municipal elections are coming up on December 8th, 2013. Municipal elections there are not the same like here or in Canada. Here, I think there's 20% of the people vote in elections, municipal level. It's not a major political event. It's normal. Canada's even worse, okay? Now, but in Venezuela, it's different. The municipal elections, especially these coming up in December 2013, are important because they're an indication of how the government is faring there, the Maduro government is faring, in the first phase after the elections of at the national level in April 2013. Now, there's every indication, and this is shown, I saw a beautiful YouTube put out by the Venezuelans that shows very clearly that the Americans are openly interfering in Venezuela to try to provoke a situation with regards to the municipal elections, funneling money so that the capriles forces to win or to create other incidents. So you have democracy in the United States in struggle against a growing new participatory democracy in Venezuela with only one goal in mind, and that is to destroy the revolution in Venezuela. Because the United States knows very well that with all its defects, it's far from being perfect, but the overall orientation of Venezuela with regards to the Latin America has made a big difference in Latin America. Latin America has changed. Sorry Obama, sorry Bush, sorry all you guys, but Latin America is not the same. It never will be the same. It is no longer the backyard of the United States. So you have, a regional bloc in Latin America composed of 33 countries. All of the countries from Mexico right to Argentina and the tip of Chile as well. All countries, and I'm proud to say, but explicitly excludes Canada and the United States. When this community was being formed a couple of years ago, I watched it very closely on television from Telesur in Venezuela. But I also carefully monitored CNN, Fox, New York Times. Do you know that the establishment of this regional bloc of 33 countries, which is objectively a major event, it was completely blacked out by the US media. You people will not know about it. So when they organize provocative activities against Venezuela or against Bolivia or against Ecuador or against Cuba, the American people are in the dark. Why are they doing it? They're doing it because they want to turn back the clock of history. I think that's a very important point, and people should watch carefully the elections that are going to take place in December 2013 on a municipal level. More provocations coming up, and of course the situation has been similar in don't have time to go into detail, in Bolivia and Ecuador, where new governments have come into being, and they proudly stand side by side with Venezuela and Cuba in this new Latin America. Even countries that are and leaders who are not really left as such, they're all together in this thing, like whether it's Argentina, Brazil, or other countries. It's an entirely new situation. So people here who are of Latin American origin here should be very proud that Latin America and the Caribbean is a region in the world that is opening up a whole new path for the entire world. A whole new path for the entire world. It is no longer a unipolar world with the United States. It's a multipolar world. We have Latin America, this new regional bloc, have very close ties with China, with the Soviet Union, with Iran, irrespective of what we think of these countries. The point is that they're having relationship with these important countries. It's no longer a unipolar world, but Obama and whoever succeeds him, Clinton or whoever, they're still working on that old mentality that they want that unipolar world back. That same mentality that comes from the 18th century evangelical viewpoint, beacon of the hill, the chosen people. And it's not by accident. The closest ally of the United States is another chosen people, Israel. Okay? So this is some important points that I'd like to raise with regards to these countries. Just before going on to Cuba, I'd like to point out that, or I could link it with Cuba, is that the United States, when they talk about the Constitution, Obama, when he goes all over the world, he said, we have the oldest democratic constitution in the world. Okay? It's true, it's very old, but that's the problem. It's outdated.
But it's not democratic.
No, that's exactly it. Now, here I have, just to make sure that no one thinks that I'm one side, I have Constitution of Cuba, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela here. But I also have the Constitution of the United States. And I challenge anyone to find the word democracy in this Constitution. It's not there. I challenge anyone to find the modern notion that sovereignty lies in the hands of the people. It's not there either. However, in the Cuban Constitution, we'll go into, which was developed in 1976, in the Venezuelan Constitution, in the Bolivian Constitution, and in the Ecuadorian Constitution, all four of them say very clearly sovereignty lies in the hands of the people. Aside from everything else with regards to environment, the right to water, and things like that, sovereignty lies in the hands of the people. In my view, that is an extremely important development, and it puts to shame the American democracy. It puts to shame the old Constitution of the United States. It puts to shame, just so you don't think that I'm prejudiced with regard to the United States, the Canadian Constitution. You know who the head of state of Canada is? The Queen of England. Yeah, and Canada's supposed to be another model for the world. That Constitution, we never had a say in the Canadian Constitution. We never have a say that, do we want the head of state to be the Queen of England? No, you see? So what's happening in Latin America? That is the new modern world that is coming into being. The old world is United States, England, Europe, that old moribund world who are desperately trying to hold on to power and to maintain what they want is a unipolar state. Now, I would like to carry on with Cuba. Okay. Now, my book is not only about Cuba, but it is one of the main features of Cuba. One of the reasons I deal with democracy in the United States, democracy in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador is to indicate to people that there's more than one way of looking at democracy. That's a major problem. Like I spoke to colleges at here, Lehman College in Bronx. Now, this is the main thing I deal with. The students, despite their openness and all that, they're very much victims to the notion there's one kind of democracy, U.S. democracy. So I deal with democracy in the United States the way I dealt with it here with you in a very rapid sort of way. Democracy in Venezuela, which is completely different. It didn't come into being through an armed revolution. It came into being otherwise. They developed their participatory democracy, and then Bolivia and Ecuador. So they're different types of democracy. And therefore, it allows me to go into the country that is most maligned when it comes to democracy and election. That is Cuba, since 1959. When the revolution took place in 1959, the United States of America has never forgiven Cuba for becoming sovereign, and secondly, had never forgiven Cuba to build a new society, even if it is not perfect, but a society based on equality, where everyone has the right to health, education, etc. They have never forgiven Cuba for doing that. And so they had this continuous propaganda that Cuba is a dictatorship, it's run by the Castros, it's run by the Communist Party, etc. It's drilled into the minds of people in the United States and elsewhere since 1959. Now, in my book, just to deal with the question of elections in Cuba, it's one of my favorite parts of my book. Like on the issue of elections after the revolution in 1959, I have a subject that who rejected the elections in 1959. Right after 1959, Fidel Castro started to have meetings with people, mass meetings with people in plazas and things like that. At one point, he mentioned, well, do you think he mentioned to people there, millions of hundreds of thousands of people, do you think we should have elections? His suggestion was actually booed down by the people. Not Fidel Castro, but his suggestion or his notion of maybe we should have elections was booed down. Why? Because the only experience that the Cuban people had with elections at that time in 1959 were the ones organized by the U.S. from 1901 till 1958. All that corruption, of election, this two-party system going from one to the other, or if it didn't work, having a coup d'etat and fascism and all that. So we don't want these elections. That was their only experience. And instead of that, the people said what we should do is to carry on our social program. That is agrarian reform, They started to nationalize major industries, including the American ones, with compensation. The only country that refused the compensation was the United States of America, while the Italians, the Canadians, the British accepted compensation. So it's not the fault of the Cubans, it's the fault of the United States of America. And started to develop these great programs. For example, a literacy program in 1961. Cuba, as you know, was a highly illiterate country. And the revolution had this fantastic notion that those few people who could read and write, we should assist them to go into the countryside in order to bring literacy to the masses of people and to the peasants. In 1961, in a matter of a very short period of time, Cuba became a literate country. So instead of having these phony elections, they did things like that. I once spoke to a few people who were involved in the literacy campaign in 1961, and they were moved by the fact when they went into the countryside to teach peasants how to read and write, and they arrived there with their small little, notebook and a pencil. The peasant did not know what the pencil was. The peasant did not know how to hold the pencil in his hand. That's how far away they were from literacy, and that was the mountain that the people had to overcome in overcoming literacy, which is something that would happen in other countries as well. So these are the type of things that the Cuban Revolution carried out in the 1960s. And in the early part, that's why I put this in my first book, right here. This is a meeting of people in which Fidel Castro made a proposal on their orientation of the revolution in 1960, 61. And these are people voting. Yeah, this is what we want. This is before elections took place. But this was how Cuban people voted with their feet and their guns in 1959, and then they voted this way in the 1960s. And later on, elections were organized in 1976. But elections of an entirely different kind in 1976. It's quite a long process. When I gave my talk in Hofstra a few days ago, someone wants to know how long are elections. The elections in Cuba, it's 7 months. It's very long. So I hope you understand. I cannot deal with it all tonight, but I just want to point out a few aspects of elections in Cuba without creating illusion that everything is perfect, there are no problems. For example, just comparing it to the American orientation towards election or that of Canada. In Cuba, at the local level for municipal elections, let's say we're a small group here, the municipality are broken down into small nomination areas of about 100 people. So let's just pretend this is a small nomination area in Havana, okay? Now, in order to be nominated to run for elections for the municipal council, municipal assembly in Cuba, for example, you have the right to propose the person right next to you. I would propose this person to run for candidate at the election. Now, you're doing that as an individual, not as a party. And you don't mention that this person, I'm suggesting him because he's a member of the Communist Party. So right off the bat, you have something different. There is no involvement of any political party in the nomination of candidates, which is very refreshing from our point of view. Where we come from, it's the opposite. Everything is controlled by these party machines, and they decide, and then people are supposed to, choose between a couple of people decided upon by these political parties. And then on the municipal level, once the different nominations take place, people have the right to vote in multi-party elections, multi-candidate elections between the different people who are nominated on this grassroots basis. And then this way the municipal assemblies are formed throughout the island. Now, on the national level, it's quite different because you cannot have these small meetings on a national level in order to establish a national parliament which has to be a reflection of the entire country in terms of region, profession, religion, color of skin, occupation, etc. That's their goal of the parliament in Cuba, is to have a parliament that reflects the entire society, taking into account everything. So I think the Cubans came out with a very clever way of trying to reproduce these small local grassroots nomination at a national level, and the only organizations that are involved in that are the mass organizations. There are 6 mass organizations in Cuba. One is the trade unions. Second is the small farmers. Thirdly is a neighborhood. Fourthly is the Women's Federation. Fifthly is the university students. And sixthly is the high school students. Why high school students? Because in Cuba, everyone 16 years and older has a right to vote. Not like other countries. And this goes all the way back to the 19th century revolutionary struggle in Cuba against Spain, where people of 16 years older had the right to participate in political affairs in that way. And then it's a very complicated thing. You'd have to read my book to really get a hold of it, but eventually elections take place through the consultation between the mass organizations and candidacy commissions, which are composed only of mass organizations. It has nothing at all to do with the Soviet model that existed before. I interviewed people who were involved in developing this new electoral system in the 1970s. And I asked them openly, is this anything to do with the Soviet system? I said, no. They were actually, before they worked out their electoral system in Cuba, the people who were involved in working it out were sent to different countries, including the United States, in Europe, as well as the Soviet Union. And they openly told me, and I quote them in my book, they said when they looked at the elections in the Soviet Union, there were some things they did not like. One thing they did not like was the overwhelming importance of the party in the elections there. Very woody type of thing. They mentioned formality and things like that. So they rejected that. And they developed their own autochthonous, their own Cuban type of elections, which has nothing at all to do with the Soviet orientation. And I thought that was quite an accomplishment. Now, of course, there are the necessity to improve the electoral system, improve the democracy in Cuba, and I deal with this quite a bit in my book by interviewing people such as social scientists and others who see the shortcomings, but say, okay, we have to improve such and such thing, we have to improve such and such thing with regards to elections, with regards to the parliament, with regards to the municipal assembly, but within the context of the revolution. So, as reflected in my book, there's plenty of space for discussion within the context of the revolution, how to improve this. And, we are fed the notion that, Cuba is a communist country, it's closed in, everyone's afraid to talk. It's the opposite. It's right. I mean, you can't find people more opinionated than the Cuban people. The same thing applies to Venezuela, and so they are used to giving their opinion, discussing and debating. And that is what is going on in Cuba now. With regards to changes in the economy, with regards to improvements in the political system, there is a very lively debate on how to improve the political and economic system in Cuba, how to improve the question of the press. For example, the press is a complicated notion. The vote on the blockade is coming up on the 29th. This is the thing that always comes up with the United States as the reason they have to keep a blockade against Cuba. There's no freedom of the speech, freedom of the press. Okay. Now, in the United States of America, in this great Constitution, it does say there's freedom of the speech and press. With no restriction. They say so, with no restriction. Now, in Cuba, they said there's freedom of the press, freedom of speech, but within the context of socialism. So Cuba is not hypocritical. So yes, freedom, this is your press, you could write, you could participate, but the idea is to develop socialism. So the Cubans are in a complicated situation. They have to get out of the old mentality of being too wooden in terms of how, and writing and all that, to be more critical, to make sure that they get the information from the administrators in order to bring this to the people so the people can actually participate just yesterday I was reading there's once again an important meeting between the leadership and the journalists in Cuba, and they insist once again that they have to deal with this problem that certain administrators in the Cuban economy keep information from the journalists. And by keeping information from the journalists, they're keeping information from the people. And the journalists have the obligation and the right to get that information in order to educate the people on what has to be done. So these things take place within the context of the revolution. It's a very complicated situation in Cuba, but trying to give you a bird's eye view. I'd like to mention one thing, that my book, there are several cutting edges of my book, I have to admit, controversial. One is the issue of democracy in the United States, the lesser of two evils. And I point out that, in my view, that one of the main dangers is liberalism. Yes. Liberalism, not conservatism, liberalism, because this creates illusions about a system. That's one of the cutting edges of my book. The other cutting edge of my book is that I take a very open and strong stance against the so-called left dissidents in Cuba. Some people might be familiar with them, for example, Havana Times. Okay? Now these left dissidents in Cuba, they say, well, we're for socialism, we're for this, we're democratic, social, and that, but we have to get rid of this authoritarian system run by the Castros. So they're very nefarious, it's very complicated. They present themselves as being socialist or left, but they're really doing the dirty work for the United States by trying to assist the United States in Cuba to create an atmosphere of opposition to the revolution, but from the left. So I think this is an important point. For example, one of the people that are quoted often by those who like the left dissidents, they quote such and such writer for this newspaper, Havana Times. Now this person who came out with a position regarding the Venezuela election in support of Capriles against Chavez. So I ask you, how can someone be a socialist, a democratic left and all that, but support Capriles against Chavez? These are the same people who are also saying that the problem in Cuba is it's an authoritarian system, and we have to find something else. So I went into the history of the left dissidents and what is their basic ideology in Cuba. And I found out that in 1958, even before the revolution, and in 1959, when the revolution took place in Cuba, the State Department developed this theory of betrayal of the revolution. They say, and these are declassified documents, which I quote in my book at length, in which they say we have to get people, what they call friendly Cubans in Cuba, who would say that the revolution is great, but Fidel Castro betrayed the revolution. That was in 1959, and this is basically the same orientation that guide these so-called left dissidents now in 2013. It was great, but the revolution was betrayed and all that. So I think it is a controversial part of my book, but I wrestle with the idea before dealing with it. Events have shown that this is a real problem, these so-called left dissidents. In the same way that liberalism in the United States is a problem, because it creates illusions about the political system in Cuba. So I think I dealt in a bird's eye sort of way view with democracy in the United States, Venezuela, and Cuba, with a couple of points on Bolivia and Ecuador. So on that point, I would like to close, and I hope I made enough provocative statements for you to ask me some provocative questions that I would be happy to answer. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Your Spanish, but already in Spanish.
Okay, great. Great, beautiful.
Anyway, they're very interesting, and we're hoping Casa is the first one to everybody said, but we're hoping there'll be other places in the city, so
Ray?
Figueroa.
F-I-G-U-E?
E-R-O-A.
Oh, Figuero.
Figueroa.